The heavy, terrifying silence of exile settled over the eastern edge of Eden. The man and the woman stood in the unbroken dirt of the wilderness. It disappears entirely, only to suddenly reappear on the very last page of the book of Revelation. The problem is not that the text is unclear. Living, green plant rather than the dead, cut timber the apostles actually had in mind. This deliberate choice of the word Xylon creates the greatest contradiction in Scripture. The biblical writers are drawing a direct, undeniable line straight back to the center of Eden, but they are completely flipping the image. In the garden, humanity approached a lush, living tree and chose an act of proud rebellion, plunging the world into a curse. Outside Jerusalem, the Son of God is nailed to a dead, splintered piece of timber, choosing an act of absolute submission to absorb that very curse. The physical wood has returned to the earth, but it looks nothing like what anyone expected. The ultimate instrument of human torture, death, and imperial shame has become the new tree of life. The symmetry is haunting. The fall of humanity began by taking fruit from a tree. The restoration of humanity begins by God offering himself upon a tree. Death entered the world through wood. Death is defeated on wood. This is not, ultimately, a story about biological immortality. It is a story about the source of true life and the brutal, unthinkable cost required to retrieve it. But the word Xylon creates a new tension. We know what the Roman cross was. It was dead. The problem is that we stop reading too early. To understand what is actually happening at the edge of Eden, timber, it had no roots. It possessed no biological life. How does a dead, blood-stained piece of wood grant eternal life to a dying world? An execution stake has no inherent power to reverse the ancient exile of Genesis. To understand this incredible reversal, we cannot merely look at the wood itself. We must look at exactly who is hanging on the branches. The man hanging on the splintered wood of the Roman cross was not just another political prisoner. Throughout his ministry, Jesus made specific, startling claims about his own identity. He did not simply claim to possess life. He claimed to be the source of it. He told his disciples, "I am the true vine." He declared, "I am the way and the truth and the life." He was claiming to be the very reality that humanity had lost in Eden. Up to this point, the question has been historical and linguistic. We have tracked how a physical tree disappeared and returned as a metaphor for wisdom, and eventually as a violent execution stake. But now, at the center of the biblical narrative, the question becomes mechanical. How exactly does the death of the Son of God reopen the gates of paradise? To understand the mechanism of the cross, we have to return to the terrifying final image of Genesis 3. We have to listen to the reason God gives for the banishment. In Genesis 3:22, the Lord looks at fallen humanity and says, "Remember the guarded gate." When Adam and Eve were driven into the wilderness, God stationed the cherubim and a flaming sword, turning in every direction, to protect the tree of life. That blade represented the absolute, holy justice of God. It was a lethal barrier. It meant certain death for any fallen, corrupted human being who attempted to force their way back into the unfiltered presence of their Creator. The sword was a boundary of fire that no human could cross and survive. For thousands of years, humanity lived on the outside of that blade. But look at what happens outside the walls of Jerusalem. Jesus approaches the locked gate of the ancient garden. He comes to reverse the curse of autonomy, to undo the rebellion that severed the world from heaven. But he does not use his divine power to bypass the cherubim. He does not find a legal loophole to extinguish the fire. Instead, he walks directly into the blade, on the cross. As the sky turns completely dark, the full weight of human rebellion is concentrated upon that single piece of timber. The judgment of God, the righteous consequence of our demand for independence, finally falls. But it does not fall on the guilty. Jesus, the innocent source of life, takes the curse of the exile upon himself. He must not be allowed to reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. He absorbs the turning flame. He endures the sword on behalf of exiled humanity. He takes the lethal strike that was meant for us, and the fire of divine justice exhausts itself upon him. This is why the Gospel of Matthew records that the moment Jesus died, the massive veil inside the Jewish temple tore from top to bottom. That heavy curtain was deliberately embroidered with the images of cherubim. It was the symbolic continuation of the Edenic blockade. When it tore apart, it was a cosmic announcement. The flaming sword has been sheathed. The cherubim have stepped aside. The cross pays the terrifying price. And the way back to the tree of life is officially reopened. This is not ultimately a story about biological immortality. It is a story about the staggering, sacrificial love of a God who would rather be pierced by his own sword than leave his creation in permanent exile. But the victory on Friday afternoon creates an immediate question. The barrier is gone. The debt of rebellion has been paid. But the physical tree itself, the flourishing, biological, triumphant reality of life has still not emerged. A dead piece of Roman timber cannot give life to the world. It can only absorb death. The cross clears the path, but the story is waiting for a final location, to see the tree actually begin to bloom. At first glance, this sounds like an angry deity taking away the cure. But look closer at the condition of the man and the woman. We have to look past the timber, into the dark, silent hollow of a stone tomb. The heavy stone rolled across the entrance of the tomb seemed to finalize the tragedy. The Roman timber had done its job. The lifeless body of Jesus was wrapped in linen, bound with spices, and placed in the cold, dark silence of a grave. If the story ended on Saturday, the cross would simply be a devastating monument to human cruelty. The flaming sword might be sheathed, but humanity would still be dead in the dirt. But Sunday morning changes the fundamental architecture of the cosmos. When Jesus steps out of that tomb, breathing the cool morning air of a new day, the imagery of the tree completely transforms. The dead Roman timber, the severed XY lawn, was not the end. It was a mechanism of planting. Think about how a seed operates in the natural world. It must be buried in the dark, covered by the earth, and broken open before it can produce anything green. The cross was planted into the ground like a dead, hopeless seed. But the resurrection proves it was actually the root system of an entirely new creation. The Apostle Paul captures this explosive reality in his first letter to the Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians 15:20, explaining the victory over the grave. He writes, "They have just rebelled against their Creator. They are fractured, ashamed, hiding behind fig leaves, and dying. Sin has infected the human condition, but in fact Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep." Notice the agricultural language. First fruits. Paul does not use a legal or political metaphor here. He deliberately uses the language of the garden. In the ancient agrarian world, the first fruits were the initial, undeniable evidence that the rest of the harvest was coming. When a farmer saw the first fruits, he knew the barren season was over. It was the first sign of life breaking through the exhausted soil. By calling the resurrected Christ the first fruits, Paul is making a stunning claim. Jesus is the first evidence of the new Eden breaking into the present, decaying world. The physical tree of life has not simply grown back in a hidden geographic location. The tree has taken on flesh and blood. This is the monumental reveal that changes how we read the entire Bible. The tree of life is no longer just a sacred object to be found. It is a person to be known. Jesus is the living tree. He is the source of endless, uncorrupted life that Adam and Eve forfeited. He is the ultimate wisdom that Solomon wrote about in the Proverbs. He is the one who absorbed the turning flame of the cherubim. And now he stands in the center of history, offering the very life that was locked away at the dawn of time. This is not ultimately a story about biological immortality. If they eat from the tree of life in that broken state, their condition will be locked into place forever. It is a story about the staggering reality that the creator of life became a man. died on dead wood, and rose again to become the living branches of our salvation. Step back and look at what has happened. The barrier is gone. The grave is empty. The new creation has been launched right in the middle of the old one. But this massive theological shift immediately forces a deeply personal question. In the original garden, accessing the tree was a physical, geographic act. You walked to the center, reached out your hand, took the fruit, and ate it. But if the tree of life is now a person, and that person has ascended into heaven, how do we partake of it? How do we, living in a world still deeply bruised by the ancient curse, actually receive the life he offers? To understand this, the narrative must move away from the ancient past. The story shifts from historical theology to the immediate, breathing reality of your daily life. The theological victory of the empty tomb is monumental, but it leaves us with an intensely practical problem. If the flaming sword has been sheathed, and if Jesus is the resurrected tree of life, how do we actually access him? They will be frozen in a permanent state of rebellion, decay, and separation, completely incapable of being redeemed. How does a cosmic victory outside the walls of first-century Jerusalem change the reality of an ordinary, exhausting week? The objection is entirely reasonable. You might look at the suffering in the world, or the pain in your own body, and ask a blunt question. If the gates of Eden are open, why do I still feel so mortal? Why is my life still breaking down? Is this tree of life just a spiritualized, abstract promise? To answer that, we have to look honestly at how we currently try to survive. Since the exile from Eden, human beings have been desperately searching for a replacement for the tree. We instinctively try to manufacture our own immortality. We build empires, obsess over our physical health, chase legacy, and place crushing expectations on our careers, our children, or our relationships. We are still reaching for the tree of autonomy. We operate under the illusion that if we can just control our circumstances, we will finally secure our own lives. But the central contrast of the biblical narrative remains. This is not ultimately a story about seizing control. It is a story about dependence. You cannot earn your way past the cherubim. No amount of human effort, wealth, or morality can extinguish the flaming sword. You can only be invited back by the one who absorbed its fire. Eating from the tree of life today is no longer a geographical journey. This is the hidden contradiction at the heart of the exile. Immortality without God is not a blessing. It is a curse. It is a daily posture. Jesus gave his disciples a concrete, physical image of how this works. In John chapter 15, he did not simply say, "Believe historical facts about me." He used the language of the garden. He said, "I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever abides in me, and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. For apart from me, you can do nothing." To abide is to intentionally draw your daily supply from him. It is the quiet, often unglamorous practice of bringing your anxiety, your grief, and your fear to Christ, recognizing that you are not self-sustaining. It is choosing the wisdom of Proverbs, a gentle tongue, a patient spirit, a forgiving heart when every human instinct demands retaliation. The early Christians understood this profoundly. They made this participation physical. When they gathered around a wooden table to break bread and drink wine, they were not merely remembering a tragic death. They were participating in the life of the resurrected Lord. The communion table became the new place of access. When you come to that table, you are reaching out your hand, not in rebellion to seize autonomy, but in humility to receive a gift. We experience the life of the tree now in part. We taste the first fruits of the harvest. We abide in the branches, and our living forever in a fallen, sinful state is not paradise. It is a permanent prison. The flaming sword was not placed at the gate merely to punish humanity. Spiritual exile is permanently ended, but our physical bodies still wait. We still live in a world where the curse has been defeated, but its lingering symptoms remain. The life we receive today is deeply real, but it is a down payment. It is not the final chapter. The biblical story began in a locked garden, but it does not end there. The Apostle John is an old man, living out his final days in a brutal Roman penal colony on the rocky island of Patmos. He is surrounded by jagged stone, the crashing sea, and the weight of an empire that seems completely invincible. But in the closing chapters of the book of Revelation, the prison walls fade. John is given a breathtaking vision of the culmination of human history. What he sees is not the annihilation of the earth, but its complete purification. He sees a city, the New Jerusalem, descending out of heaven. As the vision zooms in on the center of this radiant metropolis, John sees something that has been missing from the biblical record. Since the 3rd chapter of Genesis, he looks down the middle of the great street of the city. He sees a river of the water of life, clear as crystal, flowing directly from the throne of God and of the Lamb, looking back at a home they could no longer enter. The cool evening air was suddenly torn by heat and light. It was placed there to protect humanity. God had to banish them from the very thing that sustained them. And then, in Revelation 22:2, John writes these staggering words. On either side of the river, the tree of life, with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. The long, agonizing exile is finally over. The tree of life has returned to the earth. But notice the massive shift in the architecture. This is not simply a rewind to Eden. When God restores what humanity has broken, He never just returns it to its original state. His restoration is always infinitely greater than what was lost. In the original garden, the tree of life was a single, localized plant. But in John's vision, the imagery is magnified to an overwhelming scale. The tree now spans both sides of the vast river. It is no longer a solitary trunk. It is multiplied into a continuous canopy of life. It produces 12 different kinds of fruit, and it yields a fresh harvest every single month. It is an image of absolute, inexhaustible, relentless abundance. There is no off-season. There is no scarcity. The supply of God's life will never run out. And look at what is missing. Look closely at the borders of this new forest. There are no cherubim standing guard. There is no turning flame. The deadly sword of God's justice is completely gone, because it was entirely absorbed by the Lamb upon the Roman timber, ensuring that human death would be a temporary mechanism for resurrection rather than an eternal state of agony. The barriers have been permanently dismantled. In fact, Revelation explicitly notes that the massive gates of this city will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there. The way is permanently, undeniably open. The central contrast of the biblical narrative is finally resolved. This is not ultimately a story about humanity finding a biological loophole to escape death. It is a story about the unhindered, unveiled, eternal communion between the Creator and His creation. To eat from this tree in the New Jerusalem is to be fully alive, completely saturated with the presence of God, and forever free from the rot of sin. It is the grand synthesis of everything the Bible has been pointing toward. The garden has become a city. The single tree has become a forest. The fragile innocence of Eden has become the indestructible life of the new creation. The gates are wide open, and the fruit is abundant. But a jarring question remains. What about the rest of the world? What about the Gentile nations and empires that have spent all of human history violently at war with God and with each other? Will they simply be destroyed? Or is there another purpose for them? The answer is hidden in the very last detail John notices about the tree. The final revelation of God's heart is not found in the fruit. It is found in the leaves. The exile was a devastating consequence, but it was also an act of profound mercy. The human race was now separated from the source of life. John looks past the overwhelming abundance of the 12 kinds of fruit and notices the foliage sweeping out over the river. Revelation 22:2 concludes with this quiet, staggering detail. And the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. Think about the sheer historical weight of that word. The nations. These are the very empires that built the siege engines, forged the chains, and erected the Roman crosses. Throughout history, humanity has weaponized the wood of the earth to conquer, enslave, and destroy one another. We have spent thousands of years living in the brutal reality of the curse, fracturing our relationships, hoarding our resources, and burying our dead. But in the final act of the cosmic story, God does not simply annihilate the rebel nations. He heals them. The leaves of the tree act as a divine, restorative balm. This healing is not merely a political peace treaty between ancient, warring empires. It is deeply and profoundly personal. It is the final removal of every spiritual, emotional, and physical consequence of the fall. The profound grief you have carried, the anxiety that has haunted your nights, the quiet trauma you cannot articulate, and the illness that has slowly broken down your body. And this brings us to the central question of the entire biblical narrative. How does humanity get back past the sword? All of it finally meets the leaves of this tree. The curse is completely drawn out of the human frame, and true, uncorrupted life is poured back in. Every tear is wiped away, not by ignoring the pain of the past, but by healing it at the deepest possible level. Look at the immense, unified journey of this single biblical thread. We began in the center of an ancient temple garden, where a physical tree was lost to our demand for autonomy. We heard its echo in the book of Proverbs, calling us back to the daily posture of wisdom and dependence. We stood outside the walls of Jerusalem, watching the Son of God hang on a dead piece of Roman timber, transforming the ultimate symbol of human cruelty into the root of a new creation. And now, we stand in the center of a radiant city, looking at a continuous, inexhaustible canopy of life. This is not ultimately a story about humanity discovering a biological loophole to live forever. It is the story of a creator who refused to leave his children in the dirt. Remember the heavy, terrifying silence that settled over the eastern edge of Eden? Remember the flaming sword, igniting across the twilight, turning in every direction. This is not ultimately a story about biological immortality. It is a story about the source of true life. The tree is not a magical artifact to keep a dying human race away from the branches. For thousands of years, that lethal fire stood between us and the unfiltered presence of God. But that fire has finally burned itself out. The cherubim have stepped down from their guard. The blade of divine justice was driven deep into the splintered wood at Calvary, and it will never be drawn against you again. The heavy silence of exile has been replaced by the sound of a river, clear as crystal, flowing endlessly from the throne of God. The gates of the city will never be shut. The flaming sword is gone. The long exile is over. You are invited to come and eat. It is the ultimate symbol of humanity's unhindered access to God's own presence, an access that was lost in rebellion, but which God immediately promised to restore. The cherubim and the turning flames sealed the gate, and the physical tree was locked away in the ancient past. But the necessity of the tree never left the human heart. To understand why the tree was locked away and how it will eventually return, we must first look at what the tree actually was. The question is not whether the tree existed. The question is what it represented in the ancient world. A flaming sword, turning in every direction, ignited across the twilight. Behind the fire stood the cherubim, beings of overwhelming and terrifying power. Genesis describes God planting a garden in the east, in Eden. But to the original Hebrew audience, Eden was not a wild, overgrown jungle or a simple agricultural park. It was a temple. It was the sacred, elevated place where the realm of God completely overlapped with the realm of humanity. The rivers flowed out from it to water the earth. The ground was rich with gold and onyx. It was the original Holy of Holies of the ancient cosmos. And in the very center of this sanctuary, God placed two specific trees. Genesis 2-9 states, "The tree of life was in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil." It is crucial to notice their geography. They are not hidden in an obscure corner or placed on the outer boundary. They are planted in the exact center. Every time the man and the woman walked through the heart of their home, they were forced to look at them, to consider them, and to make a decision. This is where our modern misunderstanding distorts the story. We imagine these trees were somehow injected with divine vitamins or lethal poison. We look for a biological explanation, but the power was not in the physical chemistry of the fruit. The power was in the posture they required, stationed to block the way back. And somewhere deep in the center of that locked garden, beyond the reach of human hands, stood the Tree of Life. The Tree of Life was a physical manifestation of a spiritual reality. To eat from it was a daily act of communion. It was humanity's way of saying, "My life does not come from myself. I am not self-sustaining. My breath is a continuous gift provided by my Creator." It required humility. It required trust. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil offered the exact opposite. It represented ultimate autonomy. To eat from it was to claim the absolute right to define what is good and what is evil on human terms. Independent of God's wisdom, God gave humanity absolute freedom to eat from the Tree of Life. The provision was abundant. He only restricted the tree of autonomy. But the serpent arrived and reframed that single boundary, painting it not as loving protection, but as divine suppression. When human hands reached out and took the forbidden fruit, the act was not merely the breaking of a dietary law. It was a cosmic coup. They rejected life as a dependent gift and attempted to seize authority as autonomous rulers. They decided they no longer needed God's wisdom to govern the world. The immediate consequence was the shattering of the temple. By choosing autonomy, they severed the connection between heaven and earth. They were immediately driven outward, pushed away from the center, away from the unveiled presence of God, and cut off from the Tree of Life. Most readers of the book of Genesis view this tree through the lens of ancient mythology. We assume the Tree of Life was simply a biological anomaly. Humanity demanded independence, and the immediate result was death. The physical tree was locked behind the turning flame of the cherubim, entirely disappearing from the historical record. For centuries of biblical history through the flood, the calling of Abraham, the enslavement in Egypt, and the wandering in the desert, the Tree of Life is never explicitly mentioned again. But an image this profound cannot remain buried forever. The physical tree was gone, removed from the geography of the earth. But centuries later, the memory of that tree would return in a completely unexpected form. The physical branches had vanished, but their echo refused to fade. The physical tree was lost to the ancient past, swallowed by the wilderness of Genesis. But the language of Eden refused to die. Centuries passed. The descendants of Abraham became a nation. They wandered, fought, and eventually established a kingdom. Under the reign of King Solomon, they built a magnificent temple in Jerusalem to house the presence of God among his people. Inside that quiet, incense-filled sanctuary, the walls of cedar were meticulously carved with gourds, open flowers, and palm trees, all overlaid with pure gold. It was a deliberate, architectural reconstruction of the lost garden. Israel was trying to build their way back to Eden, a magical plant, an ancient fountain of youth that granted endless cellular regeneration to anyone lucky enough to eat its fruit. But the actual Tree of Life was still missing. Then, in the book of Proverbs, the long silence is finally broken. King Solomon resurrects the exact imagery of Genesis, but he uses it in a way that shifts the entire biblical landscape. The Hebrew phrase he uses is Etz Chaim. Etz simply means tree, timber, wood, or a stick. Chaim is the word for life, pluralized in Hebrew to express the absolute fullness, vitality, and abundance of living. The translation is accurate. But the English phrase Tree of Life often sounds to our ears like a specific biological species. In the ancient Hebrew mind, the phrase carried a deeper theological weight. It represented the sustaining power of God himself. Solomon does not use Etz Chaim to describe a hidden, geographical plant waiting to be discovered by explorers. Instead, he takes the ultimate symbol of immortality and applies it to ordinary human behavior. In Proverbs, dry Aktsen. Speaking of divine wisdom, Solomon writes, "She is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her. Those who hold her fast are called blessed. Later, in Proverbs 11:30, it declares, "The fruit of the righteous is a tree of life." We read the story as if God was guarding a cosmic potion for physical immortality. But that familiar interpretation creates a massive problem. And in Proverbs 15 gegen 4, he applies the image directly to human speech. A gentle tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness in it breaks the spirit. Notice what has happened to the architecture of the story. The tree is no longer a localized object, guarded by a turning flame. It has become a description of living in alignment with God's original design. Wisdom is the way exiled humanity grasps the branches of the tree in a fallen world. Think about a bitter, destructive argument. When a person chooses not to retaliate with venom, but instead speaks with a gentle, healing tongue, they are doing something cosmic. They are pulling the atmosphere of Eden into a broken room. They are offering a taste of the lost garden to a starving world. The tree of life is not a magical artifact you find. It is a divine reality you participate in. This is not ultimately a story about biological immortality. It is a story about the source of true life, and wisdom is the stream that flows from that source. Once the pattern becomes visible, the book of Proverbs reads differently. That would already be significant, but the word creates another problem. If wisdom is the tree of life, and Israel possessed the wisdom of Solomon, if the tree of life is simply a magic fruit, why does it completely vanish from the biblical narrative after Genesis chapter 3? Why was the world still dying? A gentle tongue can heal a fractured relationship, but it cannot defeat the grave. Righteousness can elevate a society, but it cannot reverse the ancient curse of Genesis. Proverbs offers a beautiful, haunting echo of the garden. But an echo cannot save a dying human race. A metaphor is not enough. To truly break the curse, the flaming sword must be dealt with, and the physical wood of the tree must return to the earth. A heavy beam of rough, splintered timber drops against the stone pavement of a Roman courtyard. The wood is jagged, stained with the sweat and blood of previous victims, and designed for one specific purpose: agonizing public execution. This is the reality of the first-century Roman cross. It was not a polished, geometric religious symbol. It was an instrument of state-sponsored terror and profound physical shame. But when the early apostles began to preach about what happened on that brutal timber just outside the walls of Jerusalem, they made a shocking linguistic choice. They did not simply call it a cross. They deliberately reached back into the ancient vocabulary of Genesis. In Acts 5:30, the Apostle Peter stands before the highest religious council in Jerusalem and makes for thousands of pages, through empires, vars, prophecies, and covenants. The physical tree of life is never seen again. Terrifying accusation. He says, "The God of our fathers raised Jesus, whom you killed by hanging him on a tree." The Apostle Paul does the exact same thing in Galatians Trinest, explaining how the ancient curse of sin was broken. Paul writes, "Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a Christ curse for us, for it is written, 'Cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree.'" Why do these Jewish writers keep calling a Roman execution stake a tree? To understand this, we have to examine the language they were using. The original Greek word they chose is xylon. In ancient Greek, if you wanted to describe a living, biological tree growing in a forest, an oak, a cedar, or a fig tree with roots and green leaves, you would typically use the word dendron. But xylon is different. Xylon specifically refers to timber. It means wood that has been severed from its roots and cut down. In the ancient world, it was used to describe building materials, wooden clubs, stocks for a prisoner's feet, or the heavy beam of a crucifixion. The English translation tree is accurate in linking the biblical imagery, but it can cause the modern reader to visualize a